Nothing like a scandal to start the day. Emma Rushworth, an imposing widow of 35 with eyes as calculating as a banker on audit day, was in trouble. Sitting in the study of Camden House, her elegantly oppressive mansion in London, she stared at a letter bearing the red seal of immigration. In a few weeks, she would be deported back to the United States, torn from her meticulously constructed life. "This is unacceptable," she murmured, gripping her teacup tightly. "It can be more than that, madam. It can be amusing," said David Collins, her young assistant, with a smile blending unassuming charm and sarcasm. At 27 years old, he was everything Emma found insufferable, too clever for his own good, handsome enough to distract any sensible woman, and, worst of all, annoyingly always had the last word. Amusing? Emma raised an eyebrow with the precision of an arrow. Yes, amusing. The only way to avoid deportation would be marrying someone from here, someone trustworthy. David paused theatrically, relishing the hint of desperation creeping into Emma's voice. David shrugged. "I would, for a fair price." The tension hung in the air. The silence that followed was as thick as London fog. Emma, desperate, considered the absurd idea. Marry her assistant? But she needed to protect her position and her future, and David seemed dangerously willing to play this game. "You're not joking, are you?" "I never joke when I can have fun winning." Sometimes, the absurd is the only plausible way out. Emma stared at David with a mix of distrust and irritation. He was at ease, leaning back in a leather chair, drumming his fingers on the armrest, clearly amused by her hesitation. "Let's recap, just to make sure I'm delirious," Emma began, her voice dripping with irony. "You want me, a woman of impeccable reputation." "Doubtful," David interrupted with a smile. "To marry you, an assistant with mysterious ambitions, to avoid my deportation. Is that it?" David crossed his arms, leaning forward with a provocative look. "Exactly. And considering the risk I'm taking, I think a few conditions are fair." Emma narrowed her eyes. "Conditions? Oh, of course. Why not? Since we're already steeped in absurdity, let's sink all the way." "First," he began, raising a finger, "you'll have to spend some time with me in the English countryside. My family will want to meet you. A marriage without that won't be convincing." Emma laughed dryly. "You think I'm going to tolerate a family full of charming and slightly eccentric people?" "Absolutely." David winked. She sighed, defeated. "And what else?" "Second," he continued, "you need to relax. Stop being so rigid. Try to be human, at least for a week." Emma crossed her arms, clearly offended. "Human? I am the personification of elegance and professionalism." "You are a walking fortress," he corrected. "Charming, yes, but you need to lower the gates every now and then." With an exasperated sigh, Emma finally relented. "Fine, but remember, if this goes wrong, it will be your fault, and I will take great pleasure in reminding you of that for the rest of your days." David smiled triumphantly. "A pleasure I'm willing to grant, my dear wife." An unromantic journey. 2 days later, Emma found herself cramped in a carriage with David, enduring the bumps of the countryside roads. She wore a simple dress, something that, according to him, didn't scream unnecessary wealth. "This place must be a god-forsaken hole," Emma muttered, adjusting her hat while casting a disdainful glance at the landscape. "If it's a hole, it's one filled with people who love me," David replied, unfazed. "Unlike London, where love is a currency." Emma rolled her eyes. "Cheap sentimentality. Very well, Mr. Collins. What are these lovely people like?" He smirked mischievously. "My mother is intense, my father peculiar, and my siblings, well, they are." "They are what?" "You'll see," he replied enigmatically. Upon arriving at the Collins estate, Emma was surprised. It wasn't a hole. It was a charming country house, surrounded by well-tended gardens and a gentle bustle that indicated abundant life. However, it didn't take long for her to understand what David meant by intense and peculiar. As they were greeted by Elizabeth Collins, David's mother, Emma was hugged so tightly she lost her balance. "So, you're the woman who's finally captured my little David's heart." Emma pulled back, trying to regain her composure. Yes, it's a pleasure to meet you. David observed everything with a subtle smile. Welcome to the family, Emma. Feeling at home yet? Emma raised an eyebrow, like I'm in the middle of a stage play. After dinner, as Emma tried to keep herself busy exploring the hallways of the house, an unexpected visitor arrived. The immigration officer, a thin man with eagle-like eyes, stood at the door. Good evening, Mr. Collins. I came to check on how the couple is doing. I hope you don't mind. David remained calm, but Emma felt a chill down her spine. Of course, come in. My wife and I are delighted by your visit, he said, holding Emma's hand with a grip that said, Don't ruin this now. Delighted, Emma repeated, forcing a smile as fake as a cheap jewel. The officer observed the two with curiosity. I hope Mrs. Rushworth, or rather Collins, is enjoying her new family. Emma smiled again, this time more firmly. Certainly, it's everything I've ever dreamed of. A family bound by love, chaos, and chickens? Emma woke to a peculiar sound, loud, persistent clucking. Still half asleep, she sat up on the makeshift bed in the guest room, watching the linen curtains sway in the breeze. This wasn't the sound of London, it was the countryside in its most baffling and noisy form. When she came down for breakfast, Emma found a scene as chaotic as the chicken symphony. Elizabeth Collins, wearing a floral apron, commanded the table like an army general. Henry was busy teasing David about bringing such a sophisticated wife to this humble place. While David's younger sister, Clara, 17, gazed at Emma with shining eyes, as if she were a heroine from a novel. Emma, dear, Elizabeth called, handing her a plate of scones. You'll love our traditions here. We start the day with a walk through the stables. Of course, Emma replied, though inwardly she was panicking. Who doesn't love stables? David watched the scene with a smirk, clearly enjoying Emma's discomfort. Dressed more casually, yet still immaculate, Emma followed the family to the stables. Clara, brimming with excitement, pointed at each horse as if it were an old friend. Henry made a point of highlighting the dangers of a big city like London in an obvious attempt to provoke Emma. You ride, don't you? Henry asked, his eyes gleaming with mischief. Of course, Emma replied, trying to maintain her dignity. Quite often. David leaned in, murmuring just loud enough for her to hear, Of course it doesn't. Riding up the stairs at Camden House doesn't count. She shot him a withering glare, but before she could retort, Elizabeth exclaimed, Perfect! We have the ideal mare for you. Molly is very gentle. Or not, David muttered. Reluctantly, Emma climbed into the saddle. Molly, seemingly gentle, gave a small jolt that nearly unseated her. David chuckled softly, and she silently vowed to return the humiliation twofold. After the ride, Emma found a moment of solitude with David as they walked through a nearby grove. She finally blurted out, Why do you insist on putting me in these embarrassing situations? David shrugged. Because it's the only way to get you to let your guard down. Let my guard down? I'm your boss, David. There shouldn't be any guard to let down. He stopped and turned to her, his eyes soft but serious. Emma, we're no longer boss and assistant. We're husband and wife, at least on paper. And for the record, sometimes it's good to let someone in. Emma was silent for a moment, surprised by his honesty. And you think that's a good thing for me? Absolutely. Later, as Emma tried to find some peace in the house's library, she heard footsteps at the door. It was the immigration officer again, now more observant. I hope I'm not disturbing you, he said with a polite smile but wary eyes. I just wanted to have a little more conversation with Mrs. Collins. Of course, Emma replied, straightening her posture. What would you like to know? Oh, just curious, he said, settling into a nearby armchair. How did you two meet? What made you fall for David? Emma hesitated for a moment, but then gave a smile she had practiced in front of the mirror. It was one of those unexpected encounters. He was charming, determined, and, well, simply irresistible. David entered the room before the silence stretched too long. Ah, there you are, darling, he said, walking over to her and gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Are we interrupting something important? The officer stood up. No, of course not. Just trying to better understand this charming union. Charming is exactly what we are, David replied, a hint of subtle irony slipping into his voice. When the officer left, Emma turned to David, her eyes flashing. You almost ruined everything with that tone. Me? You were about to crumble under the pressure, he shot back. We're in a sinking ship, David, and you insist on rocking it. Ah, Emma, he said, with a mischievous smile. If we're going down, we might as well do it in style. That night, as she gazed at the stars from the bedroom window, Emma found herself wondering how David could be so infuriating, and yet so intriguing. He was unlike any man she had ever known. He challenged her, made her laugh, and drove her crazy in a way no one else dared. She shook her head, as if trying to push those thoughts away. After all, this was just an arrangement. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But as she heard his muffled laughter from the hallway, something inside her began to shift. Between lies and waltzes, the truth always finds a way to emerge. The next morning, as Emma tried to gather her thoughts, Elizabeth announced that the family would be hosting a ball in honor of the newlywed. The idea of being the center of attention in such an elaborate lie sent Emma into a panic. A ball? Emma asked, her voice slightly higher pitched. Of course, dear, Elizabeth replied, delighted. A wonderful event to celebrate your union. I've already informed the entire neighborhood. That's completely unnecessary, Emma protested, casting a desperate look at David. I agree, he responded casually. But my mother never does anything unnecessary without full enthusiasm. The ball promised to be a test, not just for Emma and David's performance as a couple, but for her patience in dealing with the guests' relentless questions and the increasingly suspicious gaze of the immigration officer who had confirmed his attendance. During the preparations, Emma was literally pushed into the chaos. Clara helped her choose a dress, insisting on something more romantic. Henry, on the other hand, made sure to tease her at every opportunity. So, Emma, said Henry, as she tried on a light blue dress, what are your plans after conquering half of England with your sophistication? When Emma descended the stairs that evening, dressed in an elegant blue gown, all eyes turned to her. David was waiting for her, and for a moment she saw genuine surprise in his eyes. You look stunning, he said, and for a second his voice lost its usual playful tone. She blushed, something rare, and extended her hand to him. If we're going to pretend, let's do it with style. The ballroom was full, illuminated by chandeliers casting a soft glow on smiling faces. Elizabeth moved among the guests, introducing Emma as the best gift my son ever brought home. Emma politely answered questions about how she and David met, each lie flowing more smoothly than the last. But her confidence began to crumble when she noticed the immigration officer watching her from a corner, his eyes fixed on her like a predator. As the music shifted to a waltz, David led her onto the dance floor. The closeness was unsettling, and the warmth of his hand on her waist made her question how fake it all truly was. Relax, Emma, he said softly. We're doing fine. You're not dancing with an audience, she retorted. I am. Then give them your best performance, he murmured with a smile. The music ended, but they kept dancing, as if the world around them had disappeared. Then it happened. He leaned in, and before she could react, his lips met hers. It wasn't planned, it wasn't necessary, and it certainly wasn't fake. When they parted, Emma was stunned. What was that? Part of the plan, he replied, but his voice was different, softer, more vulnerable. As Emma tried to process what had just happened, the immigration officer approached. A wonderful dance, he commented casually. And an even better kiss. Emma froze. I hope it was convincing, she said, trying to maintain her composure. Ah, it was, he replied, but his eyes hinted at something more. Although I wonder how convincing it will be when you have to maintain this after the ball ends. David intervened, his confident smile returning. Oh, don't worry. Conviction comes naturally to us. The guest tilted his head. We'll see. Later, while everyone was busy with the party, Emma and David slipped away to the garden. She was restless, her heart still racing from the dance and the kiss. Why did you do that? She asked, crossing her arms. I did what was necessary, he replied, but his eyes didn't meet hers. Was that it? Just part of the agreement? He finally looked at her, his expression serious. "I don't know, and that scares me more than it should." For a moment, the silence between them was louder than any ballroom music. Lies have short legs, but what about the heart? That never tires of taking risks. The kiss wasn't mentioned the next morning. Emma woke with a restlessness that felt more emotional than physical. David was out of sight, supposedly busy with family matters, but she knew he was running away, from her and himself. While helping Clara gather flowers in the garden, Emma finally broke the silence to ask something that had been troubling her since the ball. "Clara, your brother, has David always been this complicated?" Clara laughed, with the lightness typical of youth. "Complicated? He thinks he's as simple as bread and butter, but the truth is, David never does anything without a reason. He's careful with the people he lets in." Emma reflected on this, biting her lip. Perhaps, in some way, she was closer to entering his circle than she had imagined. Meanwhile, the immigration officer seemed to be everywhere. Emma casually encountered him in the library, the drawing room, and even the kitchen, where Elizabeth served tea and biscuits. Always polite but observant. Always smiling, but with eyes searching for something more. "So, Mrs. Collins," he said once, while Emma pretended to be engrossed in a botany book, "you seem to be adapting well to country life." "Certainly. It's invigorating," Emma replied, keeping her eyes fixed on the open page. "Yes, invigorating. Though I must admit, for a recent union, you and your husband seem quite independent of one another." Emma closed the book more forcefully than she intended. "Every couple has their rhythm, sir. David and I understand each other perfectly." "Ah, of course," he said, leaning slightly forward. "But sometimes understanding is merely the surface of something more intriguing." What did he know? Or rather, what was he trying to uncover? That same evening, Emma found David in the stable, brushing Molly, the horse that had nearly thrown her off days before. He seemed lost in thought, his usual sarcasm absent. "You've been avoiding talking to me," she said bluntly. David didn't stop what he was doing. "I'm not avoiding, I'm processing." "Processing what? The lie we created or what happened at the ball?" He stopped, finally looking at her. "Both, maybe, which makes me uncomfortable." Emma crossed her arms, trying not to appear as vulnerable as she felt. "And why does it bother you so much? You, of all people, should know how to separate what's real from what's pretend." David stepped forward, his expression more serious than she had ever seen. "The problem, Emma, is that I can't separate anymore, not when it comes to you." The silence that followed was crushing. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't. He left before she could gather her thoughts, leaving her alone with his words echoing in her mind. Meanwhile, the immigration officer had a cryptic conversation with Henry, watched from a distance by Clara. When Emma found out, something inside her snapped. Why was Henry getting involved? "David, something is wrong," Emma said, confronting him in the library. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. Henry is hiding something, but he's not the only one. You don't fully trust me either, Emma." "Why should I trust you? This all started as a lie." "But not everything is still a lie," he countered, stepping closer. "Or are you going to tell me that what we feel now isn't real?" Emma stepped back, unable to respond. But the intensity in David's eyes told her that the truth was clear to both. They were far more involved than they had planned. The following night, during a formal dinner, the immigration officer finally revealed his true intention. He wasn't just there to observe the marriage. He had a past with David and knew the assistant had used unorthodox methods to protect Emma. "You've always been good at manipulating situations, Collins," he said with a cold smile. "But this farce won't last." David stood, his voice as firm as his intentions. "My farce was necessary because the rules are unjust. Emma doesn't deserve to be punished by a system that doesn't see her worth." Emma, surprised by the passion in his voice, finally intervened. "If you want the truth," she said, staring at the officer, "David may have manipulated the situation, but what we have now, it's real." David's actions were ultimately seen as a testament of love by most, including Elizabeth, who praised her son's courage. The officer, after much social pressure, decided to close his investigation but made it clear he would remain watchful. In the days that followed, Emma and David had an honest conversation. "So," she began, looking at him with a shy smile, "does this mean we don't have to pretend anymore?" "It's true," he replied, his smile more confident. "But what if I haven't been pretending for a while?" She laughed, finally allowing herself to admit the truth. "Then I guess we really are married, Mr. Collins." "And this time, with no conditions," he replied, leaning in to kiss her. Epilogue: Love without conditions. Months later, Emma and David were living together in London, now a true couple. Visits to the Collins estate had become frequent, and even Henry, in his teasing way, admitted that Emma was good for his brother. As they strolled through the garden of Camden House, David took her hand. "You know," he said, smiling, "the idea of marrying you was crazy, but the best things in life always start with a bit of madness." Emma squeezed his hand, smiling back. "Good thing you enjoy a challenge." And together, they walked toward a future neither had planned, but now couldn't imagine without the other. Subscribe, share, like the video.